listening to the Stoic Solutions podcast, practical wisdom for everyday life inspired by the ancient tradition of Stoic philosophy from Greece and Rome. I'm your host, Justin Vakula. Visit my website at stoicsolutionspodcast.com. This is episode 108, update on Jordan Peterson with guest Kai Whiting. I spoke with Kai Whiting about Jordan Peterson's recent comments on marriage, namely that marriage is one's best bet at happiness, and that people who choose not to get married or have children are immature and deluded. We explained that a single life can be preferable to marriage, and that one particular life path, specifically marriage, is not appropriate for everyone. Kai is a lecturer and researcher in Stoicism and sustainability at UCLouvain in Belgium. He recently published the book, Being Better, Stoicism for a World Worth Living In, and has been active in Stoic communities offering Stoic mentoring with the Walled Garden Philosophical Society. Kai's spoken at numerous events, including Stoicon, and has authored several academic papers focused on Stoicism. Enjoy today's episode with Kai Whiting. All right, I'm here today with Kai Whiting. We both recently appeared in the new book, Stoicism Today, Selected Writings, Volume 4, discussing our thoughts about Jordan Peterson. So we're here today to talk about that a little bit more.
Thanks, Justin, for having me. And it's fantastic, isn't it, that we are both there, and it kind of connects us. Like, for as long as that book is published, we have a link together. That's quite nice. And I know we've met in person.
Oh,
that's
yes,
also
yes.
Nice. Yeah.
Athens, Greece.
Yeah. So I think it's just great that we can, in say 100 years' time, they know that we had a discussion about Jordan Peterson and Stoicism. So I'm quite excited about the fact that you're in that book. Obviously, Massimo is as well. Massimo Pellugi also had his own comments. But yeah, I've been looking forward to this talk. I think we've been saying it for since we wrote that piece, right? That we would get on to discussion. But I think this is the right time, considering the developments in JP's announcements, let's say, on relationship and marriage is one of the things that we want to touch upon. Possibly not the only thing, but I think you've made some good points to me. I'm looking forward to discussing them now with you and your audience. So thank you very much for having me.
Yes, and we wrote our pieces a few years ago, so a lot has happened since. COVID happened. Now COVID's pretty much over here in the States and many other places. Yeah, Jordan Peterson didn't take too well in recent years. He had quite the mental decline, right? You want to talk about that for some listeners?
Yeah, I think, he obviously had a health issue, and a lot of things are going, have been difficult for him, and a lot of family challenges. And I do think that's why he has what I would call a political or ideological position on marriage, because, he clearly values his marriage, right? He clearly values his wife. And I do think he's a really good example of once you are married, right? Once you are married, how to maintain a healthy intellectual relationship with your wife or husband, how to maintain the sparkle and romance in your relationship. And I know in his second book, he does have a whole chapter on that. And I myself, being married, found that helpful. So I think there's two things that we need to distinguish. One, is Jordan Peterson a useful example if you're already married? Yes, I believe so. And I think in his book and his chats in general, that comes through. Does that mean that every single piece of advice on marriage is useful? No, it's a case-by-case scenario. Take what's useful and leave what's not. And I think I've said before, it's not necessarily that I like the way Jordan Peterson thinks. I like the way he makes me think, right? As a Stoic, it's in my control what I think and my attitude and my actions. And what he thinks is beyond my control. So I'm pretty much indifferent to the elements of that. The other thing that we're going to discuss is, should everyone get married? So he's very pro-marriage and he's very pro his wife, and that's fantastic. I do actually like the fact he's been married for 33 years and he's talking about these values. But I think he may well have overstepped the mark in some of his comments recently, that every single adult human being, let me caveat that, every single adult human being should get married. And that's what we're going to discuss today about, what is that linked to? What are the options? What is he referring to? How does that link to fertility for men and women, which is slightly, or it is different for biological reasons and sociological reasons? And what do the Stoics say about marriage, if anything? And where would they caveat some of his assertions? And we're going to look at the circles of concern about that. So I'm really looking forward to having a deep dive into some of these theories.
Yes, I mentioned in previous episodes that marriage might not be for everyone, and I think it's a good strength of Stoicism that Stoic writers don't prescribe one path, saying, okay, this is the way to live life. You should be this, you should have this vocation. It's pretty open-ended that we could apply virtue in many areas of life. We can take on different vocations or professions and still find meaning and flourish. And directly, I think Epictetus talked about marriage and was saying in his chapter on the Cynic calling that if you happen to get married, that you're trading things off, that maybe you won't be able to be that warden of humanity. You won't be able to be so focused on the world at large if your priorities are more focused at home and maybe for some children that you have. So even Epictetus was saying, hey, it might not be for everyone. Know what you're getting into before you get into it.
I mean, absolutely, Justin. With the circles of concern, it is clear that not every relationship is as important as every other one, right? So the Stoics say that we should treat everyone fairly, right? But treating, let's say, my wife or my husband fairly is not the same as treating my friend fairly, right? Because I can't treat you exactly the same, because that would treat my wife like my friend and my friend like my wife, which would be very unusual. And so there is clear, for example, if I do have children and I happen to be the biological father of those children, I'm the only person on this planet that can fulfill that role. There is nobody else to do it. Other people could possibly teach Stoicism. Other people could write about environment or issues, sustainability in Stoicism, or free speech in Stoicism, or Jordan Peterson in Stoicism. But no one else can be the biological father of those children, let's say, right? So there is, once you take on that role, and that's a role you can select, the only role, there is a role you don't select, i.e. being a rational human being, then it is reasonable to know before you enter that you are going to be tied to those children in a way that no other man on this planet or woman, because the biological mother cannot be the biological father, of to those children. So we must be very careful about what kind of roles and responsibilities, obligations we take on, right? So I gave an example of if you had a 4x4 and it was a fossil fueled run vehicle, it is true that you are going to contribute to carbon emissions. But if you don't take your kid to school, it is just true, if there's no alternative because you live in a rural area, that your kid will not have an education. And you're the person, you and the mother, biological or otherwise, responsible for that child's education. So the Stoics are very clear that in the circles of concern, not every relationship is equally as important. And it just couldn't be. Reasonably, it can't. You can't know a stranger's kid the same way you know your kid. And it's not appropriate for you to treat a stranger's kid the same way you treat yours for obvious reasons. So to say that marriage is for everybody is to misunderstand the Stoics, for example. It would be misunderstanding that preferences are important, that your role is important. And we could think of somebody who's decided to be, let's say, a Catholic priest. And when they took that agreement, they've agreed not to have biological children whilst they're in that role. They could leave that. I'm not saying it's forever. But when they took that role on, there was understanding and obligation that went with that. And one of them is to not bring children into this world, right? So I think that to say that everybody automatically should want to have children, or even if they want to have them, that's a different argument to if you're in a marriage, the most important person outside of your children, right, is your wife. And that's a very different argument to have, isn't it?
Yes, and some critics, some I was chatting with for previous episodes, were talking about, well, Jordan was born in a different era, he was born in a small town, and maybe the chances of him getting married, finding a great partner, were a lot higher back then. Whereas today, the laws have changed, society has changed, and many people are struggling with finding the partner, finding a good society to raise children in, get married, all these other reasons. And some people, and even Peterson has recognized this himself, some people have thought about the legal ramifications of marriage with no-fault divorce, the possibility of ending up in the family court, losing custody of children. Some people are thinking the risks of getting married are just far too strong and they don't want to do it. You add some things maybe like financial entanglement as well, where people don't want to have more government in their life. Should the marriage dissolve, things not work out, well, it's not just walking away like one would do from a traditional relationship. It's much stronger than that. So there are many reasons that people aren't wanting to get married, men and also women, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find it ironic as well. I don't know if you saw Ben Shapiro's tweet recently. He was saying that he didn't agree with homosexual people getting married because it was having an impact on sort of fertility in the US. And I was thinking, if gay men can't get married, that doesn't mean they have intimate relations with women. That doesn't mean that. So I think also, like, if we just step out of the heterosexual idea of institutionalized marriage, two men could get married, and the only thing that they can do to have children is to involve themselves either in adoption, which is not having your own biological children, which they may not feel comfortable with, because they may say, why should I mean, I've heard gay men say it, why should I be responsible automatically to support a child that two heterosexual people brought into the world? Why aren't straight couples also told, well, before you have children, why don't you adopt? Why is it only, a gay thing to do? The other thing is that it would encompass some kind of surrogacy, either from a known person, i.e. a sister, even a mother I've seen examples of, or someone you don't know, for the exchange of either food and health is an altruistic in Canada, some parts of Australia, the UK, or in terms of finances like California, where you can charge something at the moment about $60,000 to be a surrogate mother. I mean, would Jordan Peterson suggest that gay men get married and then go and have their own children, one each, let's say, find two different women who are surrogates and do that? So it's kind of strange to say everyone should get married and that marriage would automatically lead to having one's biological children within a gay scenario that wouldn't, and then denying gay men marriage in certain countries like Portugal. It has legal ramifications and financial. So in an Anglo-Saxon sort of world, in the UK and the US, you can leave your money to whomever you want within reason, right? There are some stipulations in certain states. In the UK, you can leave your money to whoever you want. You don't even have to leave it to your own children. In Portugal, if you're not married, you must legally leave a large percent of your money to your parents unless you have children. So there were cases where, gay couples were together, but because they weren't married and it wasn't recognized at the time, they would then, one of them would die and the other one would have to give basically all that money from their partner would go to the parents, and the parents would say, now you have to sell the house, right? There were examples where the individual didn't even own the house. It was just their partner's house and they would lose their own home. So there are ramifications in part of the world that Americans and Brits don't typically understand. I only know that because I've lived in different countries where being not married actually puts you at a worse situation. In the US, it's a little bit different. If you've got a student loan and you finding it difficult to pay, then someone's being married isn't helpful. In fact, someone's being married isn't helpful in terms of your healthcare. So there's a whole lot of scenarios that one needs to consider, right? Because when I've spoken to Christians who are anti-gay marriage, when I explain to them that marriage, even in the legal sense, not the religious sense, that in Portugal they would be condemning men and women to losing their own house. There was that's not reasonable. that's the law in those countries in like Western Europe and France as well. So I think that to say that marriage means the same thing financially, we're just looking financially and sociologically across the entire of Europe or the entire of the Americas, for example, I mean, that's to misunderstand realities. I think also you have to look at the caveat there and say, well, what does marriage bring? So in some cases, it does bring economic security. And you quite rightly say, in certain cases, it actually brings instability. And in terms of breakdown, a lot of the time, it is not always. It is the male part of a heterosexual relationship who is more likely to lose custody of the children, to the point that they may not even see those children again. And then they have to weigh up, like, is it the fact that I want to get married and have children, if they think that there's a possibility that they may never, ever be able to see those children should things go wrong.
Right. So some people are stepping away for rational reasons. It's not just, oh, he hates women. Oh, he's an incel. Like a lot of this shaming language and attacks that you see online. People are deliberate. People are thinking about it. They're thinking about what they're getting into. But what does Jordan Peterson have to say here? I have some direct quotes here. He's calling marriage, quote, your best chance at happiness, which I found really surprising because he usually isn't talking about happiness as some kind of like joy and pleasure. And
absolutely. I mean, and it's been said by others, and, I don't know if Apostle Paul was particularly unhappy about not being married, for example. I mean, I think for some people it is. I can talk about my own case that it makes my life easier, and I do feel happier, in that environment. But to say that every single human being would therefore feel like I feel is, to me, overstep the mark, right? Who am I to judge somebody's decision based on that? And other people they may say, well, I want to serve. Let's say they want to serve in the army, and being married is, for them, it feels inappropriate because they feel that they've attached themselves in a way that they don't want to. So I think it's to do with, again, preferences and financial situations. And my argument is the reason why marriage isn't increasing is because house prices are so high. If you want people to have more children, then the house prices have to come down, because most people, not all, but most that I've spoken to prefer to have children once they have a stable home, right? So I think it's very challenging for someone to turn around and say, oh, it's because of like the gay people, or it's because people are being frivolous, particularly men are being frivolous in their choice not to marry. But if you're living in the basement of your parents' house, how comfortable do you feel getting married? Even if you may want to, how comfortable do you feel having intimate moments with that person? And how good do you feel the fact that you're still reliant on a large extent to your parents? Because without that, I don't see that many men would want to get married under those conditions. And therefore, they're kind of saying, well, I have potentially got, sexual needs that I need to solve, but I can't bring a partner into that situation, because if you're a heterosexual man and you have sex and something unusual happens, let's say, to what you expected, then you end up having a person in your life who's pregnant, and you're like, I don't even have a double bed. I don't even have, a garage with a car in it. My car's parked outside. It's with my parents. How can I bring a child into the world? Yeah, if you even have a car. So with marriage comes expectations, right? And I was having a discussion with a friend of mine, and she said, oh, well, men get on very well and they become really good friends, even on a much more superficial basis. Well, of course, because when you have a best friend who's male, you're not thinking about your life together. You're not having a vision together about what that means. And I think if you are living with your parents or your grandparents or your siblings, or you're living in a flat share or a house share with 5 people, how likely is it that you can get married? I mean, in the UK, for example, it's very difficult to get a rented room as a married couple. It's almost impossible, because I've done that research as well today, what we're going to talk about. It's almost impossible for a married couple, or let's just say a couple, to get a room to rent. So they've got a situation where 2 people come together, they're trying to save up for a house, because they can't afford, they don't want to pay for an entire house because they want to save on the rent. They try to get into just a 5-bedroom house with 4 other rooms that are not related to them, and they can't because of restrictions. So I think that, again, it's funny, actually. It's like a luxury belief in some ways. As Rob Henderson, it's a luxury to think that marriage is accessible to everybody and that everyone would desire it. And it has been shown that if you have money, for example, if you're a football player, an American football player, or not what you'd call a soccer player in the US, you're more likely to marry young, right? I mean, you look at sports stars, they marry young. Why? Part of the reason I would suggest is because they have the resources to do so, to create a nest, so to speak, and to have children, right? If you're trying to find money, you're doing shift work, let's say you're doing social care work, heavy, hard labor, you come back home, do you have the bandwidth? Do you have the mental resources to then offer to a person in your life? I mean, maybe you say, if I have sexual needs, I think I'll just help myself because it's 5 or 10 minutes. It's not a conversation. It's not a music CD, or maybe it's a bit old now CD, not the radio. It's not all these other things that have to come into place. And I can't give that to a person. And I'm really surprised that people haven't sort of picked, people who are pro-marriage and pro-children haven't picked up on the fact, or don't reflect so strongly on the fact, that it is for economic reasons that a lot of people don't feel that they can access that. Does that make sense, Justin?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's unrealistic to think, okay, men in their, say, late teens, early 20s are going to have the same access and resources. And especially when you're considering a lot of the, let's say, superficial preferences of some women, is the short guy who doesn't have as much money, who doesn't have as many skills and resources, going to have the same appeal as the guy who has more money, as you're referring to? So maybe it's going to be a lot harder for that, like, say, 5-foot tall guy to find a partner in his early 20s compared to, the big looks guys out there. So yeah, it's unrealistic to say that, okay, this is going to be something that you can achieve. And as Peterson would say in a lot of his own work, you start with yourself, build yourself up. So maybe that guy in his early 20s isn't going to be ready for that. Maybe it's going to take him years to even get to a point where he has decent resources, a good job, rather than just a minimum wage kind of job that's not really getting him far ahead. So yeah, not as realistic. And to return on that idea of your best chance at happiness, reading through the Stoic texts, I don't recall reading like, okay, your best chance at happiness is getting married and putting your happiness in the hands of someone else and looking for that the external validation, right? The best chance at happiness, I'm thinking through the Stoic texts, is working on yourself, having that rational mindset, having good ideas about the world, and finding contentment regardless of other people. Sure, those other people preferred indifference, as the Stoics might say, might help us, but certainly not our best chance at happiness.
I mean, preferred indifference is what I keep saying to people is money, for example, is typically a preferred indifferent, but can be dispreferred, right? Because the fact that it's preferred, if it was always preferred, it would be a virtue. So if you use money to like drink a lot of alcohol to the point that you pass out, money at that point would be a dispreferred because of the way you used it. If you marry the wrong person and your life becomes a quote unquote a living hell, right? Yeah. Then that's a dispreferred, right? You'd prefer not to be married, right? Marriage is not always preferred or preferable because it depends on who you marry. I mean, it's interesting that you say, for example, about the superficial. I don't know if women are superficial in picking a short man. I say this as a short man myself. It's because there's a biological sort of, I guess, attachment there. And if there is a evolutionary reason to pick taller men, then they would want their own male offspring.
Oh, I'm saying like relating to looks is how I'm using it, rather than like a personality or other aspects. You know, like men might say like, oh, I really like women with red hair. That could be superficial, right?
Well, it's biological. I would say it's biological and probably not well considered, right? So superficial in the sense that somebody's really given a lot of thought to it. And I would say, like, you know, in the modern period, right? How important is it that a person is 5'8", 9 plus 6 foot, right? How important, and that is something that I've been researching on apps. I was doing it before we spoke. That basically, again, it's like the 20-80 rule. Like 20% of the men get 80% of the resources, and that's part of the problem. And the way that they sort of go through the serial dating, I would say, is probably what Jordan Peterson says when it's immature. So if you basically are a serial dater and you're just using other individuals, then there is not a lot of maturity in it, right? But as we were talking about before we came on and recorded, it's not a dichotomy. It's not like you have two choices: you get married and have children, or you play the field for 20 years. Because that is an immature thing to do.
Yeah. I'll catch listeners up. He said this is from the Daily Wire about Jordan Peterson's new series on marriage. It says here, in the first part of the series titled The Promise, Peterson covers why monogamous marriages are rationally, intellectually, and spiritually better than the short-term hedonistic pleasure of the single life, which produces nothing but chaotic disaster, anxiety, misery, and it goes on. So yes, you're saying it's not that those aren't the only two options. There are a lot of other options in the middle there.
Yeah, I mean, a single life, I would say even that someone's going on apps, right? It doesn't have to be apps, but it's just easier to explain it this way. They're not living the single life. A single life is a person who is, investing in themselves and their family, right? It doesn't, because people think single life means selfish. No, it means I'm investing predominantly in myself as opposed to myself and a couple of other people directly. I'm also investing in my nieces and nephews. I can have a single life doing that, right? Yeah. I don't think the serial player is doing that. They're investing in hedonistic pleasures, like the ability to have cheap and easier relations with men or women, right? It's not just men seeking women or men seeking men. So I think that the single life doesn't represent that serial person, because by definition they're not living the single life. They're living serial relationships. They're not necessarily investing in their personal development. What they're investing in is that high that they chase of the romantic chase, right? Or the number game, right? I don't think a single life is that.
Yeah, I would agree with Peterson that in many cases, the pickup artists, these guys who are saying like, I'll teach you how to hook up with like 1,000 women and this and that. And they're like so invested in it. And they're in some cases even charging guys like $1,000 an hour to speak with them. And I'm not a fan of this because I think they're exploiting these younger men who don't have social skills, who don't have experience, and they don't really have the money, but they see these gurus online. I'm not a fan of these pickup artists or pickup coaches for the most part that some call pickup roaches. I could be with Peterson on that, but yeah, the single life can be people who just aren't looking for relationships. So people who just maybe have like good friends or just aren't that interested. They're just focusing on other things. So it's not this hedonistic thing of, you'll hear this sometimes, well, if you don't want to give to society, if you don't want to be altruistic, then you're selfish, and you need to join the military and get married and like do all these other things, right? Like, oh, if you don't fight for your country, then you can't talk about it, you're selfish, you don't want to join the military. Like that's all it seems to Peterson, like coming out here like, oh, you're immature, you're deluded, it's all this shaming language because you don't want to do what he wants you to do. Like, let's hear like the better arguments rather than the shaming language.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a point that if he came out and said about the serial pickup artist, right, I would say that is deluded. I think it is deluded, and I think it is shameful, and it should be shamed. And I am very supportive of Peterson's view that shame has just disappeared off our map, right? The Stoics don't have a guilt culture. We do. They have a shame culture. They distinguish between moral shame and the general shame. General shame being imagining that I was looking at porn, let's say, and then you catch me, and I feel bad because you caught me. That's a general shame, right? That's a shame triggered because of external factors, and that doesn't actually change my behavior in a way that is linked to my character. That just means I make sure that I do that when you're not in. But the sense of moral shame, which is the truest sense of shame for Stoics, is the sense that I shouldn't be doing that necessarily if I'm already, let's say I'm married and I'm invested in that person, and I was going to have intimate relation with my marital spouse, but chose not to because actually it's just easier to go online, right? Then I'm sort of not living up to the role that I've actually set. So I think that there's nothing wrong, I don't see, in shaming certain behaviors, but I think he overstepped the mark because he kind of suggested that, as we said, that the only single man, the language was very sort of targeted towards men. The only thing that is possible is either marriage or running up and down getting 52 women a year, let's say. And that's just not the case for the majority of people that I've met who are single. They tend to be, and single as in long-term single. Some of them are definitely not by choice. Particularly women, I would say, but men tend to be academics, right? And they are very, very invested in like things like mountaineering, which are very solo kind of sports. So if you're an academic and you're really invested in knowledge and bringing that to people, right, you are bringing something to humanity. In terms of altruism, the Stoics they don't have selfish or altruism in their own framing because it's either appropriate or it's not appropriate, right? So if people are, for example, if I had a massive headache and I told you 5 minutes before and I couldn't tell you before, I can't do this today, Justin, I can't do this recording, it wouldn't necessarily me being selfish. In fact, it might be selfish of me to think that I can get away with it anyway and give your audience a substandard interview. That would be being selfish because I'm looking at my ego, right? I'm not actually considering your audience. So in terms of altruism, there's no such thing because if it's the appropriate thing to do, then it's not altruistic. You should just do it. So it's very strange. And I know what you're saying when people say, oh, well, you should do things to contribute to society. And one of the things that you can do is have children. Well, perhaps, potentially, but perhaps not. I mean, there is that argument, particularly in my environmental and sustainability field, that we have 8 billion people on the planet and that we shouldn't have children. And I think that that places the burden unfairly on women, right? Particularly in the developing world, where contraception in rural areas is not readily available. And I do think that can lead to shaming again, because I don't think that what's the alternative? Basically, women will get pregnant, right? What are they supposed to do? Abort these children? Like, are we supposed to make that are we supposed to be like China? Having lived in China, that didn't work very well in terms of a lot of people had a lot of women particularly had a sense of shame because they were only really supposed to have one kid, right? In fact, I've met, even though you can subsequently have more children now, lots of women say, well, why would I have more than one? That would be that I don't have a sense of self-control. I mean, I've heard women say that. And I found that women found it very difficult to explore relationships because they'd say, well, I can't. I just have to pick the man I'm going to marry because if I accidentally have a child with this other individual, that's my allotted one kid, right? So I think that we should not be pro or anti in terms of collective statement for the species. I mean, the Stoics didn't prescribe anything, right? There's no particular way to always eat or always dress, as I've written articles about that, or always get married. It depends on the context, right? So if you gave me an example where, let's say and this is what Epictetus did, you're an older gentleman, you said to me, I want to help this lady financially. The only way that I can do that, because I'm living in Portugal, right, is to help her like get married to her, so that we don't have the issue that we're together and she loses her house, right? I want to help her, but I never wanted children, so I decided to marry later in life. And that, and if your reasons are reasonable and they make sense, right, then what's wrong with that? I just don't like telling people. The funny thing is, Jordan Peterson's very pro free speech, so I find it very strange that someone will be very pro free speech and then anti-choice in terms of who gets married or not. It's really strange to me, right?
Yeah, it's odd. Moving on to another quote here from the Daily Wire. It says, Jordan explains that what you're sacrificing by getting marriage are the things that should already have fallen by the wayside with the advent of maturity, and that the gains far outweigh the so-called loss of freedoms.
What, like your academic freedom? It goes back to, well, what is having an academic pursuit in your life? I mean, I'm saying this is academic. I mean, there's many other ones you could pick, but let's pick that one. So if I wanted to dedicate my life to academia, is that an immature decision? I think he just needed a caveat with, I agree with him that if you think that being tied down to one woman as opposed to having a different woman every week is a terrible thing, then I agree with Jordan Peterson. I think whatever you've believed in, the idea of being this sort of very sexualized individual is something positive, even for women. And then people have said, well, you should be allowed to do this. You've got condoms. I think that's very troubling. But to assume that is the majority of people's cases, when he knows statistically, he's talked about this, and with Rob Henderson as well, that again, only 20% of men on dating apps have this possibility. So this statement that he's making, he knows for a fact, I heard him say it, that 80% of men on apps are not getting anybody. So the marriage isn't even an option, because if you're not even with anybody, how are you going to ask somebody? You can't just walk up to someone in the middle of the street and ask them, can you? So I don't know who he's really addressing that statement to, when he knows that part of the problem is that dating apps, because of their emphasis on the here and now and looks, right? Because that you don't. If you're in a bar, you might have 4 men you could speak to if you're a woman, and you find one of them is not particularly good looking, but he made you laugh and he made you feel good. I mean, you can't really do that on an app, can you? It's not very easy to show someone that, although you're balding, in my case, for example, pretty bald, as you know, that doesn't mean I have no charisma whatsoever. But if you're just basing your swiping on what I look like, then that makes it very difficult for me, right? So I don't kind of get that he does understand that this is an issue, and yet does a whole statement saying that, men, you're immature if you do this. But you, by his own admission, having read the research, like his own research, 80% of men don't have access to whatever he's talking about anyway. And I know he says, like, okay, you need to work on yourself. Yes, you do. You do need to work on yourself. But let's be honest, like, even if you do that, you still got to get over the app barrier.
Yeah, what about all these celebrities who are, some would call them high status, who end up getting divorced anyway, and they say that they were in unhappy marriages and they've lost money out of this whole deal. So some people are worrying, like, okay, if someone like Tom Brady can't remain married and his wife is unhappy, then what chance do I have as this, like, so-called average guy? So some people are, like, really thinking about this and saying, okay, well, what freedom would I lose if I got married? Like, what could possibly happen then? Or especially if it didn't work out and divorce happened. So some people are saying, hey, it just seems like too high of a price for me. Like, look, the PlayStation 6 comes out and they want $1,500. Oh, the price is too high. I don't want to pay that price. So some people are seeing marriage as being an analogous thing, that it could be a very risky, costly thing. So they're just stepping away, and yeah, let's focus on other pursuits rather than having this idealized relationship that Jordan Peterson has. He's called it, in other spaces, the perfect date that repeats endlessly, which seems to be so unrealistic.
Marriage isn't easy. It's really difficult. Marriage takes work and effort and purposeful forgetfulness and swallowing of pride and remembering that the person you're screaming at is on your team.
Well, hopefully none of that would happen, right? There'd be better communication than that. Oh no.
Right. But I mean, there's 2 human beings living in a space, and all their hopes and dreams are tied together, right? Economically and otherwise, and especially if there are children involved. And I would much rather that Peterson focused on, if you're married, here's the course to you, and here's how you maintain your marriage. Because I actually think he has really good advice on that. Again, not every piece of advice is applicable to every case. My issue is when you encourage young men and women who haven't given too much thought about what they actually want to get married and to see that as an ideal, because I think marriage is an ideal when you've worked on yourself and you know what you want and you know what you want in a partner, and you can clearly state that in the early stages of dating, right? A lot of people don't state those things until really late on, and I've always said that that's a mistake. But it takes reflection and maturity, as you've rightly pointed out, Justin, to work out what it is you want. So, like, if you don't want children, you need to be able to say that. And I don't think you're deluded for not wanting to have children, particularly if if you're a woman, like you've got this health issues, you may give birth, and you may never be able to go to the toilet in the way you did before again, and the hormones will be such that you won't remember the pain of that, and you may get the desire to have more children. There was a good tweet on this. They said being kicked in the nuts is more painful than giving birth. And someone said, "What do you mean by that?" They said, "Well, no one asked to be kicked in the nuts twice." Whereas women ask, "Can I have another child?" And that is a biological reason. Like, the body does say yes, and it's perfectly understandable. I know I don't remember that pain. I remember the pain, but I don't remember the degree of pain, and I want to go again. But some women just don't want to. They just might not feel particularly motherly. They may not want to have 9 months of carrying a child, followed by childbirth, followed by breastfeeding, followed by 18 years of something. They might say, "I've got nieces and nephews. My sister or brother can't afford to treat them," and I do know people in that situation. "I take those kids out. I give my sister or brother a break." And again, I mean, in a tribal setting, like historically, or in a village setting, not everybody necessarily did have children. Like, the fact that he makes a claim that, our ancestors, all your ancestors before you had children. Well, your direct ones did, but your great uncle might not have done. It's not true that all your ancestors did, and it doesn't make sense that they all did. It makes sense in a tribal setting that in fact, there are tribal settings that nobody really calls their biological parents mum and dad as such, because they see themselves being raised as part of the village. And in a tribal setting such as that, it's not always known who the father is, right? Because people say, well, whoever the kid looks like. But in a tribal setting, they look quite similar, right? If you think historically, the mixing of these kind of tribes, I mean, everyone looked relatively similar. So it wasn't necessarily clear who the father was, and that was not necessarily important because all the resources were pulled together in a way that in a modern society, I'm not saying it's better for worse, I'm just saying, in a modern society that isn't the case. So in a modern society where particularly where resources are accumulated, because in a more tribal setting, they're accumulated in terms of the tribe as opposed to family, that is more important. I mean, inheritance is key in modern society, right? But that's not necessarily the case in these traditional areas. So it makes no sense to claim something that historically wasn't necessarily relevant, right? Because it didn't matter if it was your uncle or your cousin. Everyone was related in that tribe, and they brought up the kid together, right? So it's very strange to use an historical argument like all your generations before you did it, so you should do it. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You could also say, well, generations before me had sex with women in a certain way, which we would say is illegal, right? And for good reason. Does that mean that I should carry on that tradition? Because
what marriage are we really talking about here when we had like coal miners' daughters and maybe 13, 14, like, okay, are we going to be advocating for that type of traditional marriage?
For example,
like, is it a historical argument? Like, I imagine Jordan Peterson wouldn't do that. So is it like cherry picking the history here?
Exactly. Absolutely. I mean, like, what kind of marriage are we talking about? And if people say, for example, even the gay scenario, well, that's just a modern thing. Well, tell that to the Greeks. I mean, like, the ancient Stoics,
the bathhouses of 2,000 years ago or so. Yeah.
Exactly. And people were saying, even Stoics, referring to people being good-looking boys, right? So it's in that culture. Do we want to bring that back? I mean, I just find that it's unhelpful. It's to say to somebody, because 50 years ago we did think we should continue doing it, when in reality the cereal packet family is a 1950s invention to sell you stuff. It just didn't happen like 150 years ago. People lived, when it's starting to now because of economic problems, like grandparents and parents and uncles and aunts, and children all living under the same roof, right? So if you live in if you're living in those conditions and you have a sibling who has kids, why would you need your own children anyway? Because what you're doing is you're ensuring that those children that you already have are going to survive. If you add to that collection of children, you're actually reducing the amount of resources are available for those, let's say, two children to prosper financially and to flourish in a non-Stoic sense, right? So I find that very strange. And of course, if you're wealthy, you don't have that issue. But I mean, how many people are in that situation? The inflation's rocketing, and house prices are climbing, and student loans are horrendous, particularly in the US. I mean, I feel sorry for anybody who's struggling, who really wants to go out, who really wants to go out and find a life partner, barely afford the app, is then told, oh, you're the man, and you should invest. And I think your man should, because, I mean, biologically speaking, this is Deborah So's argument, the Canadian academic. Like, for one sperm to be produced relative to one egg, the energy requirement is a lot higher, and the investment a woman has to make to ensure that child is born is a lot higher biologically, right? So it makes sense to me that men do offer like the first drink or the first dinner, right? It does make sense biologically for a man to do that, but not every man is right now in that has that luxury of being able to do that.
Or someone would be mad about like, oh, let's just go to the coffee shop and like, oh, he's so cheap, or it's like it's not as easy as he's making out to be, as we said, with this whole dating app scene or meeting people. It's like good luck finding that partner, like that one perfect partner that's going to be the best chance at happiness marriage. And yeah, what about people with different callings? Imagine there's, say, mid-20s guy who went to undergrad. He got a elementary school teaching certificate or degree, and he seems to connect really well with like fourth graders, fifth graders, and there's a severe lack of male teachers in elementary school. And maybe he thinks, well, hey, what if I can just benefit a generation of kids, or in this local community anyway, and I connect really well with the boys in elementary school. So maybe instead of getting married and having a child and focusing on that, maybe I just want to be a good math teacher and connect with the boys that haven't had the male role models at an early age. Like, is that deluded and immature?
Ironically, it could have been deluded and immature for the reason why those young individuals we're talking about in this hypothetical situation don't have a good role model, right? Because the father didn't understand what Jordan Peterson was actually saying and thought, oh, I should just get married then. Not thinking about, okay, what does that marriage actually mean? What does it entail? And like emotionally, I mean, I get very frustrated when people who are married and have children say, oh, well, you've got nothing better to do. Like, I'm looking after kids. What else would you be doing? I don't know. A lot of things. I'm not sitting on my bum working, looking at the ceiling because I have no children. I'm out there, I'm investing in friendships. At the same time, people are lonelier than ever, and having children takes you away from your friends, right? I mean, it's not only, oh, well, you choose that. Well, not necessarily. If you're changing nappies and you're putting a bottle in a baby's mouth, I mean, how available are you to take your friend down to the, let's say to the football match and talk to him about his struggles? How able are you to do that? How appropriate is it for you to spend 3 hours on any given Sunday to do that? And then your friend struggles and he's got no one because all his other friends are married and they're all doing the same thing. I mean, I think it's unfair. Again, the Stoics are very clear that we should treat people fairly, but that doesn't mean the same, right? So I would always look at the Stoics would always say, what's your context? Where are you? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And the Stoics are very clear as well on public versus private life, right? And idiot, the word idiot coming from somebody who's just too focused on their own private life and not interested in investing publicly. So the case that you've given of the teacher, he's thinking of a more public calling, and his private calling may be either on hold indefinitely or just he's waiting until he meets, that teacher that he's going to meet in the next 2 or 3 years and marry her. It just seems strange, right? Because also in the Christian tradition, outside of the monastic calling, surely that God calls you to be with a certain person, right? In the Christian tradition, I'm not saying it's our tradition, but so what happens if you're not called, that person's not called into your life until you're 37? What, are you supposed to be marry someone at 23 just because you feel that that's appropriate, even though it's clear to you that God's calling you to marry somebody else, but they just haven't arrived in your life yet. So I find that very strange as a religious argument, thinking, but that doesn't mean you should get married young.
Yeah, and there's a mindfulness that the Stoics call us to consider before we take action. So maybe people would feel like, oh, well, there are these societal pressures that want me to do X, Y, and Z, or the biological clock, or whatever it is. And maybe these like natural urges or societal messages aren't really great for us, or maybe they're really not good at all, as surely Seneca and many of the other ancient writers talk about the madness of crowds, the danger of crowds, and that just because the popular people think it's right, then that's not necessarily the thing that we should be doing. So you see all these messages like, oh, buy this $3,000 engagement ring and she'll be happy for life. Like, well, maybe not. maybe that's not going to be your like Disney princess, and you're going to be this Prince Charming guy, and everything's going to go well because you said and did the right things. It's just not going to happen all the time. And we could see that even closer to home with Jordan, as his daughter Michaela has been divorced, remarried, had a kid. So her, you get like Jordan is this big advocate of marriage, and surely he'd be able to like relay these messages to her in some way because they're pretty close, I would think. But Michaela Peterson, Jordan's daughter, got divorced.
I mean, marriage is like anything else, is what you make it, right? And it takes two to make it work. And I would say that's true, for example, for us to write those articles, to get, we wrote them separately, but we had to discuss things together, and we have done that in the past. And I think it made it work because I wasn't trying to grind an axe, and nor were you, right? And so you make it work. Whatever you invest in, you have to make it work. And marriage is just one of those additional things, right? I would say that people say to me, if you were in a long-term relationship, why would you advocate marriage other than the financial reasons that we've discussed? And I've said, well, that's the biggest thing you can give somebody. You can't give somebody more than yourself. Like, in marriage, that's what you agree to. And I've asked people, and they say they do feel different once they got married, right? Because for them it was it, and they knew that they were invested in that person. But that's a mindset, right? And if everybody who got married went into that with that mindset, it would be very different. So I think what Jordan should be talking about is a marriage mindset, right? Thinking about beyond oneself, and the Stoics would do the same, going beyond yourself, thinking about the common good and what your marriage can do in terms of that. How your marriage links into community, how one could equally have a marriage mindset, i.e. like to care, to bring those people into your circles of concern, but wait for the right person. And if they never, quote unquote, materialize, so to speak, then you don't have to get married. So I think advocating for a marriage mindset and advocating for, if you never find the right person to do that, but that's fine, right? It's not marriage per se that's going to fix your issues, as you've rightly said. It's having a mindset where you go, the thing that matters the most is my moral character, and marriage could make that more difficult to achieve, depending on who you marry, or easier to achieve, right? In the sense of I've got more time and space to think about it, but that's only if I use it. Again, my partner could give me loads of time and space to use it, and I just go off and watch sports. So it's not that the marriage per se is going to make me a better person. It's just that if that gives me space, because I don't have to cook, let's say, to then meditate on Marcus Aurelius's thoughts, right? That's still me doing it. It's still not, there's no way that marriage doesn't make you a better person per se, or a worse person per se. Because even if you have a crappy wife, let's say, the Stoics would say that the universe is benevolent and the universe chose to give you that wife, right? Because that's what happened. So it's not like magical, but it's just because it is what it is. And that gave you an opportunity that despite having a difficult wife, you still worked on your character and became, a sage. So it doesn't follow in Stoicism that even if you have a crappy marriage, that your character is crappy, right?
Yes, our mindset has to be this most important thing, right? Even the Stoics warned us about people think, oh, I change my environment, it's going to be better. But there's this idea of wherever you go, there you are. That, if you don't have the right mindset, you can go about globe-trotting and, go to Romania, go to Bulgaria, you can go to all these different countries. But if you don't have the right mindset, maybe that marriage won't work out. Maybe whatever you're doing won't work out. So hopefully, as Peterson would say, clean your room and then get out there in the world. Maybe you could simultaneously do a little bit of getting out there in the world and cleaning your room. But I guess that's a topic for for another day. But I think I really want more of the old Jordan Peterson back, returning to his university lectures where he's talking about philosophical and psychological themes in popular culture and media, and reviewing the existentialists. And there's like, these lectures were really, really good. And it's not like, oh, if you don't follow my path, you're deluded and immature, you need to do X, Y, and Z, or you've lacked meaning in life. maybe it's a thing of audience capture that now, okay, he's affiliated with the Daily Wire and they're pushing this like religious and traditional conservative message, and that's why he's like deeper into the marriage, or perhaps, since he has this good relationship with his wife, that he's really invested in this and he's thinking it can work for everyone else. I don't know exactly what's going on, but audience capture has been a theory of why he's shifted in the recent years.
I mean, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that the guy's so in love with his wife that he couldn't possibly understand why anybody else would want something different, right? So, if I give him the benefit of the doubt, I mean, that can still hold true, and you can still put enough caveats. I mean, to be fair, like they'll clip it, so even if it was if you produce 6 caveats, let's say, for the Daily Wire, they will clip that. The problem I have then is that it's irresponsible for the Daily Wire to do that, right? So, that's if I'm feeling generous. If I'm feeling less generous, then yes, I think sometimes, and he pointed out himself, like if you become as popular as I think he actually says Adolf Hitler, then it can be quite difficult to draw your own line, right? And say, where have I lost that line? And being an environmental engineer, I can definitely say that when he talks about climate change and environmental deterioration, he misunderstands and misreads quite a lot. So that's my own field, and I've dedicated more than a decade, probably a decade and a half now to the subject. So I'm aware that sometimes he's gone into fields that he doesn't have such a good understanding, and he hasn't then done what Joe Rogan seems to do better about bringing someone that has an alternative view to the one he has. Well, I've never seen that on his podcast, like I'm saying with Interview Me, but I say, well, okay, I do understand, for example, that I don't think Canada should give up oil, right, and then crude oil, because then you're going to go to Saudi Arabia, right, and there's social and environmental issues there. At the same time, it doesn't follow that Canada has doesn't have to have a response whatsoever. Obviously, the 8 billion thing, that we have to take that into consideration. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have children. Maybe we have a situation where we encourage 2 or 3 children, which we are doing anyway through policies that don't actually help people have kids, right?
Yeah. And maybe some more vegetarian eating instead of Peterson's and Michaela's all meat, that carnivore diet. That could be a thing.
Exactly. So, I mean, I can give I have done before in academic papers about what choices we might have to make in the West, depending on our circumstances. But I think it is very dangerous, and I'm really glad that we had this conversation to assert to a whole bunch of individuals, not just men, that marriage is the be all and end all and it's the ideal you should chase, right? Because it's not the case. I do think a marriage mindset, as I said, is an ideal that one could have in their mind's eye of, being willing to share, being considerate, understanding the human being in front of you is not against you, or is unlikely to be against you, to think about very carefully who you bring into your circles of concern, because the Stoic's clear on this. You can't push people back out of your circles of concern. So even if your wife then gets divorced from you, she's still not a stranger, right? She's still closer to you than a stranger can ever be. There's nothing you can do about it, right? She might not be your wife anymore, but she becomes your ex-wife. She's still in a circle of concern that is basically wife.
That's going to depend on the circumstances too. Like if she makes some sort of false allegation and just wants the money or something, that's like, okay, I'm just going to step away from that situation. But then there could be other things where, say, okay, you got married, you had these ideas, but over time you've developed different interests, or they really haven't been as committed as they said they would be. It could be for the men or the women. There could be some rational grounds for divorce. Like you tried to make it work, you didn't, or the other person just became so insufferable that it's like, all right, some people say this like happy wife, happy life, but maybe not. I mean, maybe you could just get yourself out of that situation. Yeah.
Shouldn't get divorced. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that what your ex-wife will never be just your friend. She's just not going to be, right? Because you've got history together. So the Stoics are not saying one should never get divorced because once your wife is your wife, she's always your wife. No, she'd be your ex-wife, but she's never. People say, you're a stranger to me. Well, she's not. She's your ex-wife, right? A stranger to you is someone you never met, right? She can't be a stranger to you. But I think that people should put as much effort into, the early stages about what they really want. And the Stoics are clear on this about feelings, right? People go, well, I feel in love. I feel this way. I feel happy. And they're like, well, examine that impression, right? Because in marriage, even if you at that moment hate your partner, and trust me, that happens. Like in that moment, you're like, ugh. The Stoics would say, well, hang on a minute, examine that impression. And actually, the Stoics, you can't be 2 things at the same time. So you can't love your wife, let's say, and be angry with her. Because you'll be angry with her in that moment. You're like, I really hate you right now, but I remember you're my wife and I love you. In that moment, you're then loving her. Then the next moment, wait a minute, but I'm really angry. And in that moment, you're being angry because the Stoics are very sort of instantaneous. Like in that moment, what are you feeling? So you can't love your wife and be angry at the same time. It's that you kind of like flip between the two. So when you have this emotion, you examine it, like, is it reasonable to be angry with my wife because she said something that I think means that she hates me? And then I have to evaluate, why do I feel that way? Why is it important that I believe that she feels a certain way about me because it's not in my control, right? It's up to her. So why am I putting so much emphasis on who she thinks I am and she's misunderstood me? Do I have to scream at her to get my point across? The answer is no. I don't have to scream at her. And then you might calm down and go, I'm really sorry, whoever your wife's called. Because actually I lost it. I let my emotions run away from me. And when I think about it again, when I take a breath, I'm actually being unreasonable. I should not assume that you think a certain way because we're two different people. The problem is if you have this, the problem is when you're going into the dating stage, the early dating stage, I mean, actually with my spouse, we did a PowerPoint presentation, right? I was like, well, you have to convince me that we should be going out. And they did a PowerPoint presentation about why, not why I should go out with them, but why it would work together, right? Really academic thing to do. So I was like, well, I'm an academic, so that works for me. But the idea was that to go beyond how I feel in that present moment, because there's that feeling will not carry you through the next 30, 45 minutes of marriage, right? It just, it won't carry you through. It's the irrational decision and reasonable decision, another reasonable decision every moment, right? Okay, is this now reasonable? Is it still reasonable? So you have an argument with your wife, let's say. 10 minutes ago, the reasonable thing to do was to hug her. Now the reasonable thing to do is leave her be and go outside and then go for a walk, right? So the Stoics are very clear on that. It's marriages or anything like our friendship, Justin, is to make a decision time and time again, to talk to each other time and time again, just chat to each other time and time again. It's a consistent chain of events. And the way that it is clipped on that Daily Wire is that it seems to be almost magical, right? And that's the danger. So I've said being generous to Peterson, I hope that was just poorly edited.
Yes. And challenging those impressions are very important, as people can get hung up in this idea of soulmate. Oh, I found this one person. They're perfect for me for my entire life. But then that doesn't work out. And they're just wanting to pursue this person again and again when they're clearly not interested. They, some people call it one-itis, maybe, that you get stuck on one person and you can't really move past that. And yeah, it could be really dangerous. So to challenge our feelings and look back and just say, okay, well, what is this impression I have? Is this rational? How should I go forth with this? So many people can just get hung up on one person, one idea, one way to do things, rather than questioning the common wisdom. And do people even really get this information at a younger age anyway, or how are they getting it? So it's just important to be really mindful and critical and make good decisions rather than just going with, oh, well, I feel this certain way, so I should do this or that. Not necessarily a good way to be.
I think there's an excellent way to end it, right? I think I can't beat what you just said. I think you're absolutely right, Justin. I think that's a really good way to end our episode.
All right, and once again, the book that we're both appearing in is Stoicism Today, Selected Writings, Volume 4, where we both talk about Jordan Peterson and overlaps, parallels, some disagreements. And how can listeners find you online on social media, email?
So stoickai.com, on Stoic, STOIC, KaiKai.com, or Kai Whiting is my Twitter. The other thing is
go ahead, spelling again for listeners.
Kai, Kai, Whiting, WHITING. If you like what Justin and I were talking about, then please get a copy of Volume 4. It goes to the Modern Stoicism charity. If you want to read more that I've done outside of Jordan Peterson, I've done a lot of work on Stoicism and free speech and being better. So it's a Stoicism for a world worth living in, which was called for by Leo, who also called for the piece with me about Jordan Peterson. And the other thing I just want to say is if you find it particularly insightful and you're interested in Stoic mentoring, I now have a Stoic mentoring program because people emailed me and said, who is offering this? And I was like, I don't know. Maybe I should offer it. So if you're interested in that, reach out. You can do that through the walled garden, thewalledgarden.com.
All right. Very good. Thank you for chatting today. Very quickly coming up on an hour here. So good discussion. Time flies.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more content. See the show notes for more information and links surrounding topics discussed in this episode. Support my efforts through my Patreon page found at stoicsolutionspodcast.com. Access special perks, including having upcoming podcast guests answer your questions, custom-made podcast episodes, and private one-on-one calls to discuss whatever you'd like. Visit my other podcast at hurdygurdytravel.com. That's HURDYGURDY travel.com to learn how to make money, save money, and travel the world at next to no cost with credit card rewards, deals, and loyalty programs. Find me in the 2022 book, Stoicism Today, Selected Writings, Volume 4. Order a paperback or Kindle version of the book from Amazon.com. Thanks to generous fans and patrons of this podcast who help support my work. Have a great day.